TzKal-Zuk and his waves have been one of the toughest combat challenges RuneScape 3 has to offer since its release. Since the release of Necromancy, many players have found an easier way to defeat him, but it's still a tough challenge to learn for PvM beginners and veterans alike. Good day, everybody. First off, this is a very long guide because TzKal-Zuk is what we call an endgame boss. For this reason, I've timestamped it thoroughly so that you can jump to parts that you want help with the most. Whether you play full manual or prefer full Revo typically, every equipment slot and inventory space matters here. Zuk tests you with fairly advanced bossing mechanics, and his waves hit you in a number of ways that require you to be actively strategic and be able to adapt to various dangers on the fly. So a chunk of this guide is dedicated to gearing, preparation, and strategy because it all matters, whether you're going budget or best in slot. I will not go over every single wave in detail because I think that would be information overload and not very helpful to many players learning this for the first time, but I will break down the unique challenge waves and general flow of the whole encounter. I will also show you recordings from 2 runs I did with my basic Necromancy setup, one where I scraped by the 3 challenge waves and survived pretty easily, and one where I passed the 3 challenges and actually achieved my first ever flawless run to unlock hard mode. The reason I'll show you examples from both runs is that if you are after your first Igneous stone, as many players watching this guide are, you can scrape by and fail every single challenge. You just have to survive and kill Zuk all in one go. Secondly, it occurs to me that much of the player base seems to believe that this demigod inherited his name from a certain reptilian social media tycoon and disrespectfully address him as Zuk. From the moment you watch this guide moving forward, please address him by his proper super badass name.
I am Zuk.
In Jasper's guides, it's Zuk. Roger, roger. Okie dokie. Lastly, before we jump into clearing Zuk with Necromancy, I want to briefly mention that one of my most popular videos to this day on my channel is my guide to learning Zuk and getting your first Igneous stone with magic. Similarly to this guide, I use basic, cheapest gear as possible and stick as closely to full revolution as is possible, outside of handling specific mechanics and challenges. For typically full Revo warriors like myself, Necromancy has been amazing in teaching some more manual combat because its powerful threshold abilities such as Finger of Death work poorly in a Revo bar, but are extraordinarily powerful if fired off manually with intentional timing. If you are struggling for now to wean off of full revolution combat and hotkeying the minimum defensive and offensive abilities to take on Zuk is already a challenge, Necromancy's extra demand for some manual combat to really make it outshine the other combat styles might be a lot all at once. So you can use Zuk and his waves as a chance to practice this and get more comfortable with the manual elements of Necromancy, which I'll explain as best I can here, or just for the sake of getting your first Igneous stone, you can refer to my magic guide as it is easier to pull off combat with a very little manual input outside of handling special mechanics. Alright, that's enough of a preface. The first thing I want to run down in this guide is how the waves of Zuk's Inferno go, and the mechanics of fighting Zuk himself. That way when we go over gearing and preparation, you have better context as to what everything is for. If you've already attempted Zuk before and you're pretty familiar with this part, feel free to skip ahead. There are 17 waves in this encounter leading up to Zuk, and fighting Zuk himself is the 18th wave. The enemies are stronger TzKal variants of the Fight Cave and Fight Kiln TzKal and TzKal. Unlike in the caves and kiln, each enemy has an additional effect that makes them more dangerous, but my advice is to ignore most of these as you're learning this and worry about developing your general strategy first. There are only 2 TzKal abilities you should know about during the waves so that you can properly and actively mitigate them. Number 1 is the bats. Just like the Fight Caves, they drain prayer when they attack you, so ideally trap them and kill them from a safe spot. Number 2 is the big magic fire lizards of the later waves. Not only should you pray deflect magic until they are dead, because they'll be the heaviest hitters of the waves, but they also apply a geothermal burn effect to you. This is a rapidly hitting magic damage over time that ramps up very quickly in damage and can kill you very quickly if you're not careful. As soon as you've killed all the lizards of a wave, use freedom to get rid of it. Be careful using freedom if some lizards are still alive, because it does have a 45-second cooldown, and the next lizard can apply geothermal burn to you again. Moving on, there are 3 types of special waves that occur in sequence: Igneous waves, challenge waves, and Jad waves. An easy way to remember when these come up is to know that challenge waves are always on the 5s, wave 5, 10, and 15. The Igneous waves are right before, so waves 4, 9, and 14, and Jad waves happen right after that at waves 6, 11, and 16. In order, the Igneous waves will spawn enemies of one combat style, as well as 3 stronger Igneous versions with special defenses. So, for example, wave 4 will contain spawns of only the weak melee variants, as well as 3 Igneous versions of them that are a bit stronger. The point of these waves is to kill the 3 Igneous enemies. This will unlock your special action button. You can use this to make Zuk vulnerable for about 20 seconds, during which you need to do 50,000 damage to him to move on to the corresponding challenge wave. You actually do not need to kill all enemies during the Igneous waves, FYI. You could just kill the 3 Igneous spawns, and when you hit the special action button, it will kill the rest of the enemies. However, for beginners, I do recommend killing everything and using safe spots as much as possible, because it's better for learning to be able to take a pause and ready yourself before you have to hammer Zuk. All the Igneous spawns have a 50% damage reduction applied and heal very rapidly unless you deal with their defensive abilities specifically. So Wave 4 contains the aforementioned melee Igneous enemies. To disable their defenses, you just need to stun them. With Necromancy, basically your only options for this are Soul Strike and the craftable weapon Special Attack. Soul Strike should be fine with the ability bar I'll show you, even if you need to harvest a soul first in your rotation. If you're in a pinch, like in the Zuk Pizza phase, the Special Attack is a much better way to go, as I experienced in a very close call that you'll see. The second Igneous wave, Wave 9, contains Ranger enemies, and the way to break these Igneous creatures' defenses is to use any, quote, powerful ability on them. This means a Threshold or Ultimate or any ability that consumes Adrenaline. Regardless of which combat style you use, this is best done manually to wipe them out as quickly as possible. With Necromancy, you have a few low-cost options at your disposal, and pretty much all of them should be used manually. Finger of Death is perfect if you have some Necrosis stacks. Bloat will work, costing 20% Adrenaline, and Spectral Scythe is a budget option costing just 10% Adrenaline for the first tier. And you have the nuclear option of the Death Skulls at 100% Adrenaline, assuming you don't have the Zuk Necromancy cape yet. You can also use either Necromancy weapon Special Attack. Wave 14, the third Igneous wave, spawns magic using TzKal. The Igneous variants here are the easiest to deal with. You just need to enter their dome, and it will break in a few seconds, disabling their defensive abilities. A useful trick for quickly entering their space is to click them to attack from afar, and once you're facing them, use Surge. This will take you directly to them or very close to them depending on your distance. This is also a very, very handy trick for the pizza phase that I'll cover later. After each Igneous wave, as mentioned earlier, you will need to ready yourself to hit Zuk hard for 50,000 damage, then immediately be prepared for a challenge wave. If you are unable to do enough damage in about 20 seconds, you will have to redo the Igneous wave you just cleared. This sounds bad, but actually if you happen to be going for a flawless run to unlock hard mode, it can be better to get Zuk close to 50,000 HP down and then wait and finish off the rest when you redo. There are plenty of examples of this in my runs here because I was saving my adrenaline for the challenge waves, and it wasn't on purpose. It's just that with my setup here, Necromancy doesn't deal enough damage to phase Zuk without using the strong abilities, so I was able to do like 45,000 damage in the 20-second period, just naturally in my rotation without strong abilities, and then I redid the Igneous waves and finished off the remaining few thousand HP with weak abilities. This can be better because passing the challenge waves or surviving them properly requires very careful use of your adrenaline and your big hitter abilities, so you cannot dump all your Death Skulls and Finger of Death on Zuk and then expect to pass the challenges. If you are only going for an Igneous Stone for now, however, always remember that you can fail the challenges just as long as you survive and do the whole run in one go, and you'll still be fine and get your stone. As for the challenge waves themselves, they can be easy to pass with the right preparation, but do require careful ability and adrenaline use, as I mentioned before. Because I haven't run Zuk in a long time and never tried him using Necromancy prior to making this video, I happened to get one run where I scraped by, as I mentioned, and barely survived most challenges, and then one run where I passed the challenges flawlessly and made it look easy, so you can see both. The first challenge wave at wave number 5 is actually passed on both attempts here because it's fairly easy using Necromancy and you have a variety of ways to deal with it. 5 volatile TzKal are spawned. They do not attack you, but they have a timer above their heads, and when it runs out after 20 seconds or so, each one that is still alive will explode and deal 6,000 damage. Thanks to Necromancy Tank Armor's ridiculous HP boost and damage reduction, this means you can actually tank quite a few of them at once at full health and still survive. The best way to clear them out actually is to have a Death Skulls ready to go. This means having 100% adrenaline ready and the ability off of cooldown. You will kill or very nearly kill 4 of them like this, and you can mop up the rest with full Revo, your Conjures, or manual firings of Finger of Death and Spectral Scythe if you want. This is because each of these volatile creatures only has 8,000 health. Note that in the full Revo-ish bar I used for these runs, Death Skulls is in there, but to pass the challenge wave, I moved it off while damaging Zuk to make sure that it's saved for the challenge, and then after the challenge wave, I moved it back. This is a consideration you only need to think about if you plan on leaving Death Skulls in your full Revo bar for the duration of the encounter. The second challenge at wave 10 spawns one unbreakable TzKal, which attacks you with melee. Like the TzKal of the previous challenge wave, this one also has a timer and explodes for 6,000 damage after 20 seconds, but this one has 20,000 HP, and it needs to be killed to pass the challenge. Sounds easy enough, except that it has a unique ability to soak up any damage that hits for less than 3000, so most or all of your basic abilities will do effectively nothing to it. In my failed run here, you can see I managed my adrenaline badly and dumped some of my stronger abilities into damaging Zuk, so I didn't have enough strong abilities ready to kill the thing and it blew up. Again, not a big deal if you just want the Igneous Stone, you just have to survive. On the other hand, if you make sure to have Death Skulls ready and build some Necrosis stacks on Zuk, you can down this thing very quickly. Challenge Wave number 3 at Wave 15 requires the most variety in abilities and unlocked abilities to pass, or 100% adrenaline and some buffs to barricade. Let me explain. 3 Fatal TzKal are summoned, you cannot attack them, and they take turns hitting you very hard for 4 hits at about 8,000 each hit before damage reductions. The one close to Zuk fires a gray attack, which is typeless. This is the north one. It is guaranteed to attack first and guaranteed to attack 2 out of the 4 times. The western one fires a green ranged attack, and the eastern one uses a blue magic attack. It is possible for these two to each attack once, or for one of them to attack twice while the other does nothing. So to pass the challenge for a flawless run, you cannot take any damage. The base strategy is to use Resonance against the first hit, since it's typeless. Then use Devotion, and use the correct Deflect prayer for the next 2 hits. The 4th hit will be typeless, but Resonance will be on cooldown, so in order to take no damage, your only real remaining option is to have Disruption Shield unlocked from Livid Farm, be on the Lunar Magic spellbook, and use that. Otherwise, you can just tank the last hit just to survive. Or, if you make sure to have 100% adrenaline at the start of the wave, you can use Barricade with a half-decent shield and some buffs to it, and just invalidate all the hits. What you see here is a total disaster of my first Necromancy run at this. I don't know what happened. It's been so long, and I wanted to do the barricade thing, but I messed up my adrenaline, so it threw me out of whack. So it didn't really work, but as you can see, I lived, and I took a lot of hits, but again, thanks to Necromancy tank armor, there is a lot of room to take big hits and just chug food along the way and make it through. My second run, on the other hand, went exceedingly well, with way more than enough time on my barricade. You can use barricade with Bone Shield active, but its duration is dependent on the tier of your shield, so since Bone Shield gives you a low tier, I opted for a Spectral Spirit Shield. You don't even need to use a Necromancy Shield, actually, for this, since you'll only be using it here throughout the entire encounter. But it helps for the shield to be augmentable, because you can get Turtling 4 as a perk fairly easily. This will greatly extend the duration of Barricade. I also have 2 Elder Malatops in my player-owned farm on Anachronia, so this also adds 3.6 seconds to Barricade. This does require a farming level of 117, though. From what I saw here, you should be fine with at least a tier 70 or 75 shield with Turtling 4. Worst case, if your timing is off with the Barricade, you can Resonance the last hit if you want that flawless run. Okay, that's all for the Igneous and Challenge waves. The Jad waves come right after each Challenge wave. You should be well used to these from the Fight Caves and Kiln, just Prayer, Flick, Ranged, and Magic Deflect as needed until they're dead. The Jad waves are really just regular waves with regular enemies, but with Jad also. Wave 6 has 1 Jad, Wave 11 has 2, and Wave 16 has 3. This segues nicely into going over the general strategy for all the waves, which is primarily stand here. The northwestern corner of rocks is the safest place for you to hide and trap and manage how many enemies you're fighting at once and how many are hitting you at once. It is worth noting that the wiki and other guides suggest a different safe spot for a few of the waves, but for a beginner that has enough on their mind already, I don't think that's worth trying to remember, to be honest. I think you can worry about the best safe spot per wave when you're more comfortable with this and are trying hard mode. The first Jad at wave 6 spawns to the south and will be trapped there if you're standing in the northwest safe spot. This means you can sit in the safe spot and deal with the other enemies first and then go to Jad. Just don't forget that it's a Jad waiting down there for you. I've done that before. The next 2 Jad waves will have a Jad that spawns in your safe spot corner, but don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to react accordingly, and you won't be in melee distance if you stand around the fire. And this is the best safe spot still to keep the majority of enemies off of you while you deal with Jad, or vice versa. I don't want to talk too much about the common waves, because again, I don't want to overload you with small details as you're learning this complex encounter, but loosely speaking, they introduce stronger enemies after each challenge wave. Waves 1 through 4 are melee focused. Staying in the safe spot will keep you away from the strong meleeers, and eliminating the rangers should be your top priority. Waves 6 through 9 are ranger focused. Same strategy applies, but focus on these larger, stronger rangers first as they hit hard. It's worth praying Deflect Range instead of Soul Split while they're alive. One important note here is that all ranged and magic enemies have a pretty big attack range, much larger than your Necromancy attack range, so This can be dangerous if you want to keep auto-retaliate on, and I do recommend keeping auto-retaliate off. You can use your safe spot to hide and draw these enemies a bit closer so that you can peek out and hit them without leaving your safe spot. Don't worry if this sounds hard, you get the hang of it with the rangers in the early waves, and you'll see that it's pretty easy to pull off. Waves 11 through 14 are mage-focused and introduce the big, strong fireball lizards. As I touched on earlier, parade deflect magic while these are hitting you, and use freedom to clear the geothermal burn effect they give you after they're all dead. If it's taking you a long time to kill them, you can use devotion while praying deflect magic, and it will totally nullify the burn damage for a while. Generally speaking, have devotion ready to go in a pinch anywhere in this encounter. It's quite nice here because if you plow through enemies quickly enough, devotion's timer gets extended quite a lot, blocking lots of damage for you. That's all you should know for now regarding wave strategy. The rest will come with practice. There is no cookie cutter strategy for Zuk's waves. You will need to adapt to different enemies and different types of damage coming at you on the fly. The best thing you can do is practice, and if you haven't tried your first run yet, expect to give yourself a number of attempts before you even reach Zuk. Regardless of how many times Zuk demeans you and calls you a weak, feeble worm and a disappointment and a failure can be the best teacher for an encounter like this. The experience of running through this a few times will prepare you better than any in-depth guide. Also, you will make money along the way. Each enemy you kill adds drops to the rewards chest, and since Necromancy craftable gear runs dirt cheap, even if you die during several runs, your death cost will be so low that my guess is you'll still profit. Before we get into gear and abilities, we do still have some important strategy to cover. After the triple Jad wave, you must fight Haar-Aken, and then finally you defeat Zuk. Haar-Aken is a boss that can be easily steamrolled here, even with a basic tier 90 Necromancy setup if you're doing it right, or it can be a really long fight that drains all your supplies before you reach Zuk. He has 150,000 health and works the same way as the Haar-Aken from the fight Kiln, where he periodically pokes his head up for a while, basically does nothing, and then goes back down and has tentacles that attack you, with a few differences. First off, it is not true that Haar-Aken here does nothing himself except his tentacles. Haar-Aken will bombard you periodically. It can be easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but the giveaway is when your screen shakes, move a few tiles over. You will get a blob dropped on you. When Haar-Aken is under, you'll get a message on your screen saying Haar-Aken is bombarding you. Move farther away. The bombardment happens in like a X pattern of lava across the screen. Do your best to avoid that. It has some negative effects like draining your adrenaline and maybe draining your prayer. I forget, but I noticed my prayer dropped a lot during this fight. The other difference with this Haar-Aken versus the Kiln Haar-Aken is that this one has a damage reduction applied depending on how many tentacles are alive. So besides the fact that the tentacles deal pretty decent damage to you, it is in your interest to kill as many as possible while Haar-Aken is down if you can't do all the 150,000 damage in one cycle. Because the more tentacles that are left alive, the more they will reduce the damage that Haar-Aken takes, and it adds up quite a lot. Now, in my first attempt here, I actually teleported out at Haar-Aken, not because I was losing too much health or food or whatever, but because I seriously misjudged how much prayer restoration I would need. Again, it's been a while. But the valuable insight here is that I did my best to stay full revolution, and I did my best to not trigger like Finger of Death or any manual abilities like that, just to keep it full Revo friendly. It takes a long time to kill him this way. And because of the submerging and the tentacles attacking you, it'll drain a lot of supplies if you have to spend a lot of time killing Haar-Aken. My second attempt, I actually planned on going full Revo just to see it through, but instinctively I just started firing off Fingers of Death and Bloat. I made sure to throw in Death Skulls, and I went a little bit more manual with it regarding these stronger abilities. And as you can see, I almost killed him in one cycle, or at least I got him down to like a third of his HP. So the assumption with taking on Zuk is that you are not totally a full Revel warrior anyways. Please do your best to be active with Finger of Death and abilities like that while you're fighting Haar-Aken and make that fight go much faster. The same applies to Zuk actually, and since that's all you need to know about Haar-Aken, let's move on to Zuk. The basics of fighting Zuk are have deflect melee up because his melee auto attack hits for a lot of damage, and deal with his mechanics properly in sequence. Now, his mechanics throw off beginners because there are a lot of things to remember about handling each of them. I devised a little way to remember what to do for each mechanic, and that is the order of abilities that you need to use to handle each mechanic are as follows. Number 1, Freedom. Number 2, Double Surge. Number 3, Surge. Number 4, Resonance or Nothing, or just tank it. And number 5, Pizza Phase, which is its own strategy. So that's how I remember it. Freedom, Double Surge, Surge, Tank It, Pizza. Here's why. The first mechanic, the very first thing that Zuk does to you is apply the Geothermal Burn. That's the same magic burn effect that the Fire Lizards apply to you. make sure you wait until it's actually applied to you and then use freedom right away. It's really easy to mitigate. Also, if it helps you remember better, he always says, "You will break beneath me," as he does this. His next mechanic happens after 3 auto attacks and is called Sear, and he will say either Sear or Suffer while he does it. This applies 15 stacks of searing pain to you, which drains your constitution over time, seriously draining your health. It's annoying, but it is mitigated by walking or moving. Moving 1 tile removes 1 buff stack. This is the double surge item on my list of mechanics to remember, so surging twice will do it. Only do this if you have double surge unlocked. I do highly recommend that for this fight, specifically if no other reason to have double surge. Or you can also surge and then dive a few spaces. Or at minimum, you can surge and then walk 5 spaces to clear all the debuffs. Double surge is the best because it's the most brainless, and you'll end up in the same position if you're facing him, and it requires the least amount of thinking and panicking while you're running around. His next mechanic happens 3 more auto attacks later. It is called Quake. He will yell either "Tremble before me," "Fall before my might," or "The earth yields to me." This one is a bit tricky. The way to get out of this one is also to surge, but the timing is a bit important. Basically, he spawns a few quakes around you. They do some damage, and they apply geothermal burn, which sucks. So the way to avoid them is to simply get far away, which means to just surge 1 more time. But wait until his sword hits the ground to surge. That is the right timing for the quakes to spawn on your current location, and the right time to get out of there. If you surge too early, the quakes will just spawn on top of you, and you're screwed anyways. If you surge too late, you'll have geothermal burn, and freedom probably still not off of cooldown yet. Be advised that with this and the previous mechanic, although more so with this one, you will be outside his melee range for a little bit if you surge, so he will hit you with a magic attack instead that is also very powerful. You can flick to deflect magic if you're not too distracted, or just get back within his melee range very quickly. His next mechanic occurs just 2 auto attacks later. It is called Empowered Magic, and he drops a big rock on your head. He will shout either "Die," "Be gone," or "Fool's Flame burns within me." This one is optionally tankable. With the Necromancy gear available, you'll take just over 4,000 damage. Your other options are to have good timing with Resonance to totally nullify the hit, or use something like Debilitate and Reflect to halve the damage, a Power Burst of Vitality to boost your health, whatever, things like that. In both of my runs here, I meant to do something to mitigate this mechanic, but I forgot both times. A, I forgot that it only takes 2 auto attacks for this one to come after Quake. And B, by the time I was done panicking over handling Quake, it came. So I didn't have time to react to it, and I just let it hit me. It's fine. Just make sure you have more than 5,000 or so health. Now, after 4 auto attacks, the famous Igneous Rain or Pizza phase happens. By his 3rd auto attack, or just before his 4th, use Anticipation. This is because the first thing he will do is stun you. And that is very bad because you will need to move very quickly, because Zuk will push you to a random edge of the map and rain fire all around you, except for 1 pizza slice. This open pizza slice, free of fire, will always be counterclockwise to your current position. Very quickly, very shortly, you will see the flames become more intense, at which point you start taking heavy magic damage very fast every tick. So, at this point, switch to Deflect Magic. Now, the Igneous melee creature will spawn in the free pizza slice area with no fire, so target that minion and use the surge trick to get to them very quickly. After you surge, if you're still in the fire for some reason, prioritize getting out of there and then kill the minion. Remember that this is the one that you need to stun, so either have Soul Strike on hand, or for this particular phase, just use your weapon's special attack, the basic Necromancy weapon. Remember that Raciel's weapon does not stun, so it won't work for breaking the defense. You have a very short amount of time to kill this thing before the pizza pattern on the floor changes, and you'll have to move again. In the open place, still counterclockwise of you, the ranged Igneous creature will spawn. Remember, this is the one that you just need to use the Threshold ability on, so use the same surge trick to get to them, and use any Threshold. Spectral Scythe, Finger of Death, Bloat, and then just DPS it down to kill it as fast as you can. The last creature is the Igneous Mage that spawns, again counterclockwise to your current position once the lava shifts. Use the surge trick to get to them very quickly, and step inside their shield dome to disable it, and then destroy them. By this point, you need to make sure that you have killed all 3 of these creatures, because you will need all 3 Igneous energies absorbed in order to make the special action button appear again. You need this special action button to stop what Zuk has been doing this whole time, which is charging up an instant kill attack. He will instantly kill you if you do not activate the special action button in time. In my first run that you're watching here, it is again a disaster because I panicked and I took too long to kill each minion. However, you can see that there actually is quite a decent grace period here. I probably made it by like 1 tick, but by the time I reached the pizza phase again, I handled it much better. This time I just used the weapon special attack right away on the first Igneous minion, killed him quickly, went off to the second one, used one finger of death that I had remaining with my adrenaline, and then just used basics to kill it. And then the third minion, I just let full Revo fire off Death Skulls and take care of that very quickly. So if you handle this well, you have plenty of time. And at this point, the fight just restarts. The whole attack loop starts over again, and he'll do a few auto attacks and then start with Geothermal Burn. Now, there is one strange thing that I have noticed a few times that I've killed Zuk. I don't know if anybody else has seen this or if it's common, but he will lead with Geothermal Burn after a few auto attacks after the pizza phase, starting at the beginning of his rotation again. And then after a few auto attacks, he will do Geothermal Burn again. This sucks because this is the one that you need Freedom to clear. And by the time he does it a second time, for some reason, Freedom is not off cooldown yet, and the Geothermal stacks just build. So at this point, I panicked. I let it ride out for a little bit, and when the magic damage starts getting very high, I switch to Deflect Magic and have no choice but to just tank his melee hits. Fortunately, with my setup here, Zuk was almost dead at this point, so I only had to tank a little bit and just hit my Chug Bruise button until he was all the way gone. Again, I don't believe this is supposed to happen. I don't think he is supposed to use Geothermal Burn twice because that sucks. I don't know why, but if anybody knows why, please leave it in the comments so that me and everybody else can know. Alrighty then, that's all the fighting. That took a while, didn't it? It's a lot to cover. Now I want to cover gear, and I want to cover abilities that you'll need. This will also take a while, so strap in if you need help with this part. I am using tier 90 Necromancy tank, armor, and Cinderbane gloves. Firstly, please don't try this with less than level 90 Necromancy. Ideally have 99, but the tank armor is for learning because it helps us survive a lot of hits. As you saw from my runs, there were a lot of instances where if I was using power armor, I probably wouldn't have survived. I am also using the tier 90 Necromancy weapons, and I actually recommend them over, well, I recommend the main hand weapon over Racial's weapon because of its stunning special attack, which you saw is important in the previous part for the Igneous melee minion. I only swapped out Cinderbane gloves instead of the Necromancy tank gloves because for the waves, they help deal a lot more damage. Zuk is immune to poison, but the minions in all the waves are not. For this reason, I'm also using a good weapon poison and a Blood Reaver familiar, and the Vampirism aura. I'll touch on all these individually, but just so you know, that synergy provides a lot of damage splats on your targets and a lot of chances for poison to proc. This is the only piece of tank gear I recommend substituting until you're a lot more comfortable with this encounter. I'm also using an Amulet of Souls. You can use an Essence of Finality, of course, if you have one. I'm just going with the budget Iron Man option for myself here. I have a Necromantic Nexus that holds all the Necromancy runes and Ectoplasm to save up a ton of inventory space. I have a Scripture of Wen in the pocket slot, which at this point is pretty affordable and is the best for clearing out waves, as it can do a lot of damage to enemies clumped together. I no longer have my Fight Kiln Necromancy cape because it is already a Zuk cape, but assuming you're going for this, you probably have your Kiln Necromancy cape. You should use that. Otherwise, use the next best available cape for Necromancy. I'm using a charged up TzKal-Zuk ring, which you should have after the Elder Kiln quest. You can charge it with TzKal by talking to somebody in the main plaza in the Tsar city. And it boosts damage against volcanic creatures, including TzKal here, by 10%. This also does not help you with Zuk, but it will help you a lot with the waves. If interested, you can bring a better ring switch for Zuk or a Luck of the Dwarves for Zuk. If you don't have a passive effect, Enriched Pontifex ring yet, but you have the Enriched Pontifex ring, that's also a good option. My inventory I kept as simple as possible, though I mentioned earlier in the video that I underestimated the amount of prayer drain that this place takes you through, so I totally ran out of Super Restore vials. You can bring Super Restore flasks for a better time, or even better, use Powder of Penance. You can bring a spare powder to be safe, or just scatter one before you go in, but for reference, both runs here took me less than 30 minutes, so one should last you plenty because it lasts for 30 minutes. It won't restore all of your prayer, but for reference, in this successful run, I only used 2 flasks of Super Restore after using 1 Penance powder. So you can have a lot more food in your inventory than I did here. Ceradomin brews are recommended as food, especially flasks, especially a lot of them have some solid food. You can do better than sharks if you want to here. Again, this is my Iron Man, I'm just being budget. But it should just be some emergency eating food. 1 overload, 6 dose should do you just fine. Have your best one. I have an holy overload. Also, as mentioned before, I have a decent weapon poison, enhanced Excalibur for periodic healing, and a nice shield with turtling 4 for that barricade challenge. I'm using a Blood Reaver familiar, not with scrolls because that's expensive, even for an iron. If you're not familiar, Blood Reaver scrolls heal you periodically for like 1000 HP, I think, which is really helpful. They are expensive, so if you want to afford that, you totally can, and it'll help you a lot. But there are two other reasons I'm using the Blood Reaver. The first is the poison synergy I mentioned earlier with the Cinderbane gloves, since Cinderbanes make it so that each damage splat you do to an enemy has a 1 in 7 chance of making poison happen. And the Blood Reaver adds a ton of damage to enemies for each source of healing you have. So I have Soul Split up most of the time, I have Vampirism Aura, and I have my Ghost Familiar healing me. The Blood Reaver adds a lot of negligible damage hit splats, but each of those has a good chance to make poison hit as well. The number 2 reason has to do with the Ghost and or its Haunting command, I'm not sure, but for some reason the damage that the Blood Reaver does from its effect from the Ghost healing you is really high, higher than it does for other sources of healing. So we're still talking maybe like 150 to 200 or 300 damage splats, but they happen frequently, so I don't know, it adds up. Other options are a Pack-Yak or your best Beast of Burden familiar. If you're learning and you're concerned about going through a lot of food, I will say that when I was first learning this, I ended up dumping a yak's worth full of food because I didn't need it all, and I had a Ripper Demon pouch just for Zuk that I brought along with me. So the Ripper Demon is also a good, I don't know about budget option nowadays, but it can do high damage to a single target, especially if you spam scrolls. Alright, that's all my tangible gear. Now for the intangibles, we have Invention Perks and Archaeology Relics. My weapons have Precise 6 and Aftershock 4. If you're on a budget, Aftershock 4 can be replaced with Equilibrium 4. Against Zuk, this will matter very little actually, but in the waves, Aftershock will help a lot because it does AoE damage. It will speed things up quite a bit if you can afford it. My armor has Crackling 4, which deals periodic damage, which is great. I have Impatient 4, which is a big bump in adrenaline gain, and I have Enhanced Devoted 4. If you're not familiar, this one takes up 2 invention slots on your armor, but it is amazing because it has a very, very high chance of the devotion effect proccing for your deflect prayers, reducing all damage to 0 while you're using deflect prayers. So in a lengthy encounter like this with hard-hitting enemies and multiple of them hitting you at once, it has a high chance of proccing and helps a lot in reducing damage you take. I have Invigorating 4, which is really helpful with Necromancy because what this perk does is that it gives you a little bit of extra adrenaline when you do a auto attack. And since Necromancy's auto attack is used fairly often in your rotation actually, it helps a little bit with adrenaline. Lastly, I have Undead Slayer, which is completely irrelevant here. It's just left over from my other bossing. A better option to have instead of that, if you're not on an Iron Man budget, is to have Biting as high as possible instead of Undead Slayer here, because having a higher chance of getting critical hits with Necromancy is great, like with every other combat style. Now, lastly, my Archaeology Relics. I have 120 Archaeology, so I have maximum relic space from all the mysteries unlocked. Not everybody has this, but the most important abilities that I have are Fury of the Small. This requires level 97 Archaeology, is pretty much a staple for all PVM, and it gets you 1% extra adrenaline from each basic ability cast. I also have Persistent Rage. This requires level 98 Archaeology, and it regenerates your adrenaline outside of combat steadily. This is not very important for here, but it is a convenience feature that I like in general for camping bosses. It's only a little bit helpful here in the Igneous waves when I'm just kind of waiting to damage Zuk and I wait for my adrenaline to get back, but actually you can attack Zuk while he's invulnerable also, and your adrenaline will build up, so it's more useless than other places here. But again, it's a convenience piece for me and a relic that I just keep on all the time. My last relic is a little bit better, but it does require level 118 Archaeology, and that is Conservation of Energy. This gives you back 10% adrenaline after you use an ultimate ability. This also brings me to the last intangible perk I have that's important, which is the Ring of Vigor passive effect, which does the same thing. So in total in my setup here, every time I use an ultimate, I get back 20% adrenaline. This helps a lot in my rotations. Now, if I had to recommend anything better, you could have Darok's Memento instead of, say, Persistent Rage or Conservation of Energy if your Archaeology level isn't that high. That will increase your damage a little bit by a fraction of your missing health. For a lot of this encounter, you will have a lot of missing health, so it is actually quite a good damage boost. And the relic is actually called Berserker's Fury, the power, sorry. If you still have a space open, you can also have Font of Life, gives you a small HP boost. You can have Blessing of Het, that increases healing from food. If you don't have double surge, but you want the mobile effect, but don't have perk space on your gear, you can also put Shadow's Grace in there, which gives you the effect of mobile, basically, which reduces the cooldown of surge, escape, and dive, and bladed dive by 50% down to 10 seconds. This also helps you navigate a lot of Zuk's mechanics, only if you don't have double surge. And that's all for gear. We are almost done preparing for Zuk here. But the last thing to go over is our abilities, our revolution bars, and hotkeyed abilities. I did say revolution bars plural if you are planning to go more full revo than not with this, because you should have a multi-target bar and a single target bar. They will be very similar because there's not very many abilities to fill on each, but here it is. Here is my multi-target bar. The main priority is the ghost and the skeleton up front. I will say my second successful run, I did replace the Conjure Ghost here with Conjure Undead Army. It is kind of a high Necromancy requirement, requiring level 99 Necromancy and the highest tier of Well of Souls talents unlocked. But it is amazing because it saves you a lot of time in conjuring all your minions. If you don't have Conjure Undead Army, I do recommend hotkeying the Conjure Zombie and using that periodically throughout the fight because it is excellent for AoE damage thanks to its poison. The bread and butter of this AoE bar, again intended for full Revo players, is Soul Strike towards the front, Soul Sap to harvest souls, and then Touch of Death for adrenaline, as well as Necrosis stacks whenever you feel like firing off a Finger of Death. I also put Death Skulls towards the front here because, I don't know, it's decent if you want to leave it there and you really want to go full Revo. Otherwise, I actually do recommend just keeping track of it and firing it off manually during the waves when it's most appropriate. I have the Command Skeleton ability here in the Revo bar, and if you watched my AoE Necromancy DPS video by chance, you'll note that I did find it really inefficient to have it here for an AoE scenario, but the reason it's there is that I also put Bloat in the Revo bar here. Again, this is one that is better to leave off and fire manually as you think is appropriate, but again, if you insist on going full Revo and don't want to work that hard, you can have Bloat in your Revo bar at the very end here, but in order to ever use Death Skulls, you also need a little bit of buffer by having the Command Skeleton there. This way, Bloat will fire off pretty often, but not so often that your adrenaline goes down to 0. Your adrenaline actually will recover over time with the rest of my setup and with this bar, so that by the time Death Skulls is off cooldown, you will be able to use it again every 60 seconds. So that's the most full Revo warrior way to go about it. One core ability for AoE of Necromancy that is missing here is the Spectral Scythe. I do recommend having all 3 tiers unlocked, but you cannot have it in your Revo bar because of the attack range. You need to attack from more than 1 space away, because using your safe spot in this encounter is very critical, and you do not want to be running out of your hiding spot thanks to full Revo on accident. That being said, it is very, very helpful to hotkey your Spectral Scythe and use that whenever it's appropriate, whenever there's a clump of enemies and whenever something is within 1 square of you, or 2 actually, halberd range. Now, for quick reference, running with this setup here in my first unsuccessful attempt, it took me 25 minutes to get to Haar-Aken, and that was with minimal extra input. Like, I didn't do Finger of Death manually or whatever, things like that on enemies throughout the waves. I didn't use Threads of Fate to do extra AoE damage, whatever, anything like that. 25 minutes to get to Haar-Aken. In my next run through, I took off Bloat and Death Skulls from my Revo bar. I forgot to take Command Skeleton off of there, but I should have, and I just used Conjure Army. I did use the Threads of Fate incantation to do brief AoE damage, and I paired it with like Volley of Souls manually fired off or Finger of Death fired off to clear out groups pretty quickly. The entire encounter from start to defeating Zuk took 25 minutes, so that's the slight difference there in time if you're willing to manually fire off abilities like that. Threads of Fate in particular is fun for just brief spurts against large clumped together enemies if you have a powerful Volley of Souls or Finger of Death lined up. My single target bar for full Revo friendly warriors is not that different. Mainly I removed Bloat, I removed Soul Strike, and I put Volley of Souls at the very end. This is because it's most efficient to use that when there are as many possible soul dot stacks built up as possible. And I added Living Death after Death Skulls. This is also different than the optimal full Revo Revolution bar for bossing that I discovered in a previous video, but that's because the bar in that video involves Finger of Death and Bloat and involves you being at 0 adrenaline pretty much all the time. And for this encounter, you need adrenaline for certain defensives or abilities like that to survive. So I wanted to try out this bar because it leaves you with full adrenaline most of the time outside of Death Skulls and Living Death usage. Also, it leaves plenty of room if you do want to manually fire off a Bloat or Finger of Death. It leaves it totally open to whatever you're comfortable with, and as you get used to this encounter and practice it more and more, you can start to weave that in. Also, Living Death greatly boosts the amount of Necrosis stacks you get and the power of Finger of Death, so you can also practice getting used to saving your Finger of Deaths to make sure you also have some to fire off during Living Death as well. Plus, if you practice more, once you do have your Zuk Necro Cape, you can practice more intentional Living Death, Death Skulls rotations a bit more manually, so it'll help for that too. Now, as far as hotkeys or abilities to have handy, there are a lot that I recommend / required to survive this. First one that I recommend heavily is Darkness, the Necromancy spell or incantation. It gives you a 20% chance to dodge incoming damage from attacks for 12 minutes, which is great. This stacks with the roughly 10% chance you get from having full tier 90 Necromancy armor, or a little bit less than that if you're using Cinderbanes, but either way, you'll have an almost 30% chance to dodge every single incoming hit, which is awesome. Invoke Death is another incantation I strongly suggest having on hand. I would use it only for maybe Jads, Haar-Aken, and Zuk himself. This will auto-execute a lot of those once they're low HP and save you a lot of trouble. It'll execute the Jads with around like 10,000 health, Haar-Aken a bit more, and Zuk when he reaches 30,000 HP. Lastly, for Necromancy, an optional but very helpful one I touched on earlier is Threads of Fate. You can use this every 45 seconds, and for 6.6 seconds, all of your single target attacks will hit everything in a 4x4 area. So if there's a large cluster of enemies clumped together, you have some Finger of Death stocked up, go ahead and blast away. It'll just help you with the waves a little bit faster. It is important and very helpful to have each of the Deflect prayers hotkeyed, magic, range, and melee, as well as Soul Split. You should try to use Soul Split during the waves whenever possible, and deflect prayers only later on as damage intensifies from a specific source like range or magic. Against Zuk, more experienced players can Soul Split Flick because his auto attack speed is actually quite slow, but most players can just hotkey, protect melee, and keep that there. On the note of prayers and curses, I totally forgot to mention earlier, I'm using the Sorrow highest tier of Necromancy prayer. Definitely have that, it helps a lot. There are several defensives you'll need through this fight. Freedom and Anticipation are important. Freedom for handling the Geothermal burn effect, Anticipate for the pizza phase to not get stunned right before Zuk does that. Also have Resonance handy. Ideally have Bone Shield active, that's one Necromancy ability I forgot to touch on, but you can just leave that on all the time. It's one less thing to worry about whenever you need to Resonance, or Reflect, or Debilitate during certain mechanics we covered earlier. And I strongly recommend having Barricade hotkeyed and handy for the third challenge wave if you can keep your adrenaline at 100% for the start of that. The last important defensive you'll need is Devotion for use throughout the waves, throughout the challenge wave, and whenever you feel like it's handy. As far as other ability categories, you need Movement. Have Surge, much preferably Double Surge, hotkeyed, and Dive as a backup. Escape you don't really need in this fight. And I believe that covers it as far as core abilities and curses. The only other thing I have hotkeyed that's important is food. I just have Brew as hotkeyed and I eat sharks manually. You can do that however you want. I also have a hotkey for vulnerability bombs if you want to use that on like Haar-Aken or Zuk. Super helpful. I left that out of my setups here because I know for a lot of beginners it's just one extra thing to worry about and it complicates things. But if you're used to using vulnerability bombs, totally do it and hotkey it. And that's it. That's the whole guide. Let's wrap this up. I probably missed something. I'll mention in the comments if I did. There's a lot happening here. I hope not, though. Anyways, if you think I missed something, please leave it in the comments. It'll help everybody. If you have any general tips for learners that you found handy when you were doing this that was not covered here, leave that as well. This is a tough overall encounter. It is an excellent success as a spiritual successor to the Fight Caves and Fight Kiln, both of which are really easy in RuneScape 3 now. It can be frustrating, it can be thrilling, and positively, it can be very rewarding. I really hope this helps. Please also let us know in the comments how your attempts went after watching this guide, or after not, whatever, and let us know what helped you. If you did enjoy this, please consider giving this video a like and my channel a subscribe for other super helpful guides like this one. Thank you very much. I appreciate your watch time, and I'll catch you in the next one. Good luck.